Now that you already have an understanding of what the view model pattern is, in this next part I want to dive a bit deeper in the different building blocks in more detail. Once we have this covered, we can start building an application using MVVM. And let us start with the view. The view is really the user interface. For the biggest part, the code that in an MVVM setup will live here will be the XAML code. Your XAML code won't be very different when building MVVM compared to when building without MVVM. It'll be heavily based on data binding. The view model will be bound to by the view, since that is the model for the view. The code behind part, on the other hand, will be nearly empty, which we'll see in the next module. There can still be code in the code behind, as long as it's not doing any business logic or working with the domain classes. This type of code doesn't belong in the view, and therefore not in the code behind. It'll be moved to the view model. If you need some real UI code, that can still go in the code behind. So setting the focus, changing a color, creating an animation, that is typically code that will go in the code behind. It doesn't even belong in the view model. Here you can see a snippet of typical MVVM-based view code. But wait, that looks pretty normal now, doesn't it? Well, indeed, I'm happy that you noticed. This code is regular XAML code that uses data binding. We are here binding the text of an entry to the name property of this selected pie. You will see very soon that selected pie is a property of the view model. The main actor of the whole MVVM story in Xamarin Forms is of course the view model. The view model is basically the glue between the view and the view model. It sits between these two. We've already said earlier that the view model is the model for the view. But what are its main functions? A view will expose state and operations. State is data that will be prepared by the view model for the view to bind on through data binding. Operations are functions, methods which will be invoked from the view through commands, and we'll see those later. They will replace what we originally had in event handlers in code behind. A view model is really the manager for the application. It also handles the flow. In other words, it's the view model which will decide that when we click on a button that we'll need to navigate to another screen. That is flow. The view model in general must also be testable. I've already mentioned that once we start bringing in UI components, that code becomes harder to test. Well, we create view models so that our code will be more testable. That's why we should not have any UI element references inside our view models. Here you can see a sample view model class, although a simplified one. A view model is really nothing magical. It's a class, indeed, a regular class, nothing more. In general, one view will correspond to one single view model, although that can differ. I prefer to give my view model classes a name suffixed with view model. So, if this view model would be the view model for a pie detail view, it will be called the pie detail view model. The view model exposes state, so data, for the view. That can be seen here as the property exposed on the view model class, the selected pie property. For data binding to work correctly, mainly to ensure that changes in the data are picked up correctly, the class needs to implement the iNotifyPropertyChanged interface, and that is done here as well. Finally, the model. The model is in fact nothing really special. Anything that has to do with data interaction or logic is part of the model. This can be your entities as well as the code to get and store data, whether that data is retrieved from a REST service or stored locally in a SQLite database. Typically, we will bring in a repository that is used for data interaction. The model has a simple interface and will be used by the view model. So that brings us back to the full picture. In MVVM, we have three main building blocks. The view, which will data bind onto the view model through data binding. The view model is a class which exposes state and operations and will interact with the model to get and store data. Through change notifications and data binding, the view will be notified if the state of the view model has changed.